Hello, hello, hello. I am Phylum, and I am here today to talk to you about evolution. So, there have been a couple of phylum that have come and gone. This phylum, I'm a bit more of a traditional phylum. You know, we tried a thing with the gaming thing, but now we're back to talking about biology and stuff. So, why have I decided to talk about evolution today? Well, that is because I know that many of you have begun to take biology and are maybe a couple of weeks in, and I think that I had a few options, right? So, in my debut stream, I talked about wanting to do something like biology hype streams, because I didn't want to just be a biology learning channel, because there are plenty of YouTube channels out there who can do that better than me and who have extensive catalogs of biology to learn from. I wanted to do what I thought was like the fun part of teaching, which is to talk about stuff that I actually find very exciting. And I hope you will find exciting too. So when I cracked open the AP biology textbook and saw what was the chapter 1 of the book, it was the chemistry of life, the building blocks. So if we go down the tree of complexity, we know that chemistry comes before biology. And so to understand biology at a cellular level, we have to know about chemistry. But I don't want to do that. So what I want to do instead is talk about the fundamental foundation of modern biology, which is based on evolution. So I am of the opinion that it is very difficult to appreciate modern biology without an appreciation and understanding of evolution, which is what I'm here to talk about today. So, it's kind of difficult as a biologist to think back to the days before Darwin, just because evolution and natural selection make so much sense. I'm not entirely sure I have to explain this, but evolution is a fact. It is not up for debate. That's not just because scientists are pig-headed. It's because evolution is a little bit like math. If you have certain assumptions in a mathematical proof and you connect them logically, the conclusion is true. And evolution, as we'll see later on in this chat, follows that kind of same form. There are some base assumptions that are observed to be true, and that naturally concludes to evolution, and natural selection is the way that evolution happens. So before Darwin, there were two main camps, right? There was the camp that thought that species were immutable or unchanging. So this has overlap with this concept called biological essentialism. Biological essentialism being the idea that things like living beings are comprised of an essence which defines them. So we call things dogs because they are a list of traits that belong to the category of dog. And so these species were supposed to be static and unchanging. And so there's this scientist called Louis Agassiz, not entirely sure how to pronounce that name, but he believed that species were unchanging, reflecting the mind of the creator, basically espousing the fact that the species that exist were created and designed, obviously leaning into his own religiosity. But this idea wasn't as common as people might think pre-Darwin. There were actually plenty of other people that had their own ideas as to how and whether or not species changed. So we get into this gentleman called Comte de Buffon. So this guy started noticing some things. And when looking at the different forms that cats and lions and tigers had, Buffon thought to himself that perhaps these animals shared a common ancestor. In fact, maybe all animals share a common ancestor, all the way down to maybe 38 primordial forms. So maybe all cat-like animals came from the same cat-like precursor. But then that begs the question, where and how did that precursor come to be? And to that, Buffon would just maybe shrug his shoulders and say that that precursor was zapped into existence. So that's kind of where things were at in terms of how people thought of evolution. That as even people who believed in the mutability of species, so even though that there were people who believed that species could change over time, we're still stuck with this question of how these creatures originated, right? A major contributor to this belief was the fact that fossils and the fossil record at this time in history was pretty bare. So people didn't really know about dinosaurs. And because they didn't know about dinosaurs, it was commonly believed that animals just didn't go extinct, that every animal that existed since the beginning of time continues to exist in the present day. There wasn't really a way at the time to confirm that any species had gone extinct. That was until the birth of archaeology and paleontology. So basically, when you start digging up the bones of dead animals, you start to realize that maybe not all of them are still remaining on this planet. So that does lead us into our first major fossil collector, Georges Cuvier, or Cuvier. So part of the limitations of biology at the time, or study of the natural sciences, was access to the fossil record. And it was very rare for any collector to have enough fossils to be able to pull any information out of them. Cuvier was unique in the sense that he had a lot of money and a very extensive fossil collection, and began to see some peculiarities, mainly noticing that there were bones that he was collecting that didn't appear to belong to any living animal, right? A part of his collection were mammoth bones. And so even though things like elephants exist, a mammoth completely outclasses them. And so if no one has seen the bone that Cuvier has dug up, it would be pretty striking evidence that maybe sometimes animals disappear forever. And this leads to an interesting philosophical question. If every species that had ever existed since the beginning of time still exists, then how could there be extinct animals? And if animals are truly capable of going extinct, are we all heading to some kind of death spiral, right? Like if we had all these species to begin with and they just keep dying, are we all going to go extinct in one direction? Well, considering how much time has elapsed since the beginning of recorded history, that becomes unlikely. And so the idea of new species being created was on the top of people's minds. And to that, we go to our next slide, which is talking about a scientist that got quite the hard break, and that is Lamarck. So, Lamarck is primarily known today for being a bit of a laughingstock. I'm actually not going to get into the reasons why people don't look very fondly upon him today. I think maybe he deserves even his own episode. But his contribution to the development of Darwin's ideas comes from this thing called the two-factor model. So, here was the pressing question at the time. How are new species being generated when we know that species are capable of going extinct and extinction hasn't happened yet? There was this idea that new species were being created or adapted. So Darwin actually isn't the first to realize that. A lot of people are very keen to give Darwin credit for the theory of evolution, but Darwin's theory is a lot more nuanced than just the idea of evolution, because people before him were already thinking of such things, right? Including Lamarck. So this is the two-factor model, and there are two axes to this quote-unquote evolution, and that is the complexifying force, which turns species into more complex species. So if we go from jellyfish to worms, insects to mollusks to vertebrates, you can see how there is the affect of a complexifying factor, that these species are growing more complex. And so when you say to yourself, well, then what about cats, lions, and tigers? Lamarck might say that the effect on the cat precursor has undergone an adaptive force. So within the family of cats, or Felidae, there's an adaptifying force that branches cats out to house cats, to tigers, to lions. And the reason why I like this model so much is because it makes a lot of sense. Not in the sense that it's actually correct. We know that this isn't how evolution works today. But if you take a quick glance at this flowchart, it just kind of makes sense, right? It can help explain a lot of the complexity and variation in the animals that we see today. So this is inherently not a bad idea. So this is also responsible for really igniting Darwin's own thinking on how evolution works later down the line. So as hard of a time we give to Lamarck, I think he had some pretty good ideas too. So with the stage set, we get to talk about the man of the hour, Charles Darwin. So, here's the thing about Darwin. Darwin is not a rags to riches story. Young Darwin was extremely privileged. He was privileged in the sense that he is the child of very affluent people, right? So, his grandfather was actually a famous biologist, and he was a son to two fabulously wealthy doctors. He had an extensive education and even begun to pick up the trade of being a doctor from his father. He also learned how to do taxidermy from a freed slave. Darwin's grandfather was actually very much an abolitionist, so that's pretty cool. He did other things like interning at museums, studying plants. But in his education, he found natural history to be boring. He also found his father's trade, medicine, to also be boring. In fact, he put off a lot of his studies, preferring to ride and to shoot than to actually concentrate on his work. So I fear that by saying this, I am propagating the myth that very brilliant people don't work hard in school. That's not really the case, right? All the people that drop out of college to start their own company, they had something. It's not that school is useless. It's that some people don't need all of it all of the time, right? Darwin himself was very well educated. It's just that the thing that he was made to be educated in, he did not find very helpful. Along his educational journey, he picked up beetle collecting as a hobby and made connections with a botany professor. So kind of like in rebellion to his father, Darwin picked up a bunch of seemingly random biology related hobbies, which we'll see down the line actually becomes very helpful. So these hobbies of his end up being useful scaffolds for him to develop his eventual theory of evolution, right? And this is just a shout out or a reminder to anybody still going through school that just because you have all these options as to what classes you could take, it doesn't really mean you have to have it all figured out immediately, right? So if you're taking classes, yes, it's somewhat important for you to have a direction to go towards in college. Certainly, if you know straight from the start of your life in college what you want to do, you can in fact tailor your whole coursework surrounding that passion of yours. But most people don't actually figure out what it is they want to do until much later. So it's never a bad idea to take a couple classes that you might not have an immediate use for in whatever career trajectory you might think you have, but rather take a couple classes that just interest you purely for the sake of them interesting you, right? Oftentimes, the greatest problems in that we have to tackle are ones that are on the edge of cross-disciplinary studies to begin with. So you never know what toolkit you might need later down the line in terms of what you will end up doing your work in, right? And so Darwin didn't really have an idea of what he wanted to do. He enjoyed studying things that we now call biology, but kind of dicked around in his other studies as well, right? Right. So Darwin was very well connected, so well connected that his botany professor was actually able to get him onto the vacation / trip of a lifetime. Through his botany professor, he gets to travel on the HMS Beagle on a worldwide trip. So these trips were actually sponsored by the English government as research trips, by the Navy particularly. And these were on paper very, give me 1 second, the AC is going off. All right then. So, where was I? So Darwin was 22 when he gets this incredible opportunity to travel the world in pursuit of his studies. And it took a bit of convincing for his father to let him actually go on that trip. But, you know, he's a rich kid, and with some convincing, his father eventually agrees to fund this trip for him. And this trip for him is awesome. It's basically a chance for him to do all of the weird biology collecting he wants. And he didn't know at the time that this trip was going to lead him to the formation of his theory of evolution. Right? So he's 22, young kid, traveling the world, collecting stuff, looking at beetles, eating tortoises. The seed of the idea of an origin of species was not really in him at the moment. Right now, he's just having a blast, being a rich kid at that age, and going about having a good time. But this worldwide voyage really has a deep and meaningful impact on the young Darwin. He gets to meet all sorts of different peoples along his journey. He sees a lot of wildlife from all over the world. And he really starts to think about man's place on this planet. So even though origin of species is not exactly on his mind, he starts to view humans as less special the more he travels around the world. One of the stops on his trip is the Galapagos Islands, which has become a very famous aspect of his trip on the HMS Beagle. It is here where Darwin observes the eponymous Darwin's finches. So Darwin, for all the weird things that he studied, was not a bird scientist. He did not study birds. It was just a thing that he did roaming the Galapagos. He partook to taxidermy, to collect species that he found on these relatively isolated and new islands. And at the time, his work with these birds really didn't mean all that much to him. He was actually more interested in preserving these specimens to bring back to England to have people who actually know a thing or two about birds to look at, right? So he's just out here collecting stuff. It wasn't until he brought these birds back to England that he learned that there was something particularly interesting about these birds, right? So we all know that Darwin's finches, first of all, he actually didn't know that they were all finches, by the way. He thought that they were all sorts of different birds, and it took him talking to an actual bird scientist to learn that he had collected, he collected a bunch of birds, right? Not all of them were finches, but he did not expect for 12 of them to be finches. He thought those 12 of the birds that he had collected belonged to all sorts of different bird families, but no, it turns out they were all finches. Reflecting upon this, Darwin thought to himself, that's interesting that they all have enough commonalities to all classify them as finches. And he noticed that those finches were actually quite similar to birds that he had seen on the South American continent. So right by the Galapagos Islands, which are isolated, he noticed that those 12 finches had aspects similar to finches found on the mainland. So even though these finches looked quite different from one another, they all shared similarities with the birds that were found on the continent. So this observation is a part of the argument that he will make later on. But just know that the moment that Darwin saw these finches, he did not immediately think that they were very significant at all. But when he gets back to England after this long journey, he begins to cook something up, right? He shares his findings with other scientists, and through this collaboration begins to think that he really has something here, that there's something very tempting about his observations made on the HMS Beagle. And so begins Darwin's next arc, the 20-year grind. So between the publication of The Origin of Species and his trip on the HMS Beagle, he spends 20 years crafting the perfect way to describe his theory, right? And this time was greatly characterized by a lot of work, a lot of collaboration, a lot of secrecy even, and a lot of interesting details about Darwin's life. So here is an image of Darwin, and in a letter to a friend, he writes, "If I really have as bad an expression as my photograph gives me, how I can have one single friend is surprising." And this is something that I really appreciate about Darwin, or the fact that we know so much about Darwin. He wrote a lot, and he has a way of words that I find to be extremely entertaining. It is at once it is simultaneously written in this old-timey English, but at the same time, it's very relatable, right? Who hasn't felt this feel, right? In this time, he also thinks about marriage. So again, he's spending 20 years and he's grinding and he's reading a lot and he's writing a lot and he's thinking a lot. But here, in that time, life is passing him by and he starts to think about marriage, and it's not something that he is 100% behind. So I'll read this quote from Wikipedia. Used to jotting down daily notes on animal breeding, he scrawled rambling thoughts about marriage, career, and prospects on 2 scraps of paper, one with columns headed "Marry" and "Not Marry." Advantages under marry included constant companion and a friend in old days, better than a dog anyhow, against points such as less money for books and terrible loss of time. This is very much a Sigma male. Darwin is a Sigma male with the Sigma male grind set, right? This was a very scientist way of thinking about personal relationships, right? A pro and con column. very fun, but maybe not fun if his partner found out, right? So, in this 20 years where he's grinding at his grand theory about evolution, he's cooking up different aspects of his experiences, right? So, he's got his finches, which seem to have similarities to the birds found on the continent, but also have adapted specifically to the islands that they were on. So, each finch for the island it was on seemed to adapted a beak or evolved a beak that was specific for the type of food that they were able to forage on that island. This combined with Cuvier's fossil records and the two-factor model as ideas for the diversifying of species, it's all coming together in Darwin's head, but there's something missing. There's not really a way to craft an argument out of just these components alone, especially because there is no way to experimentally validate any of these. This is just, for lack of a better term, musing, right? But he comes across an essay that gives him the last piece that he needs. So there's this economist or population scientist, Malthus, and he writes in an essay about population growth, and he notes that populations would exponentially increase, but obviously that hasn't happened, and why not? And that's because populations live in environments where resources are finite. So that really gets Darwin thinking about the role that the environment has to play in terms of guiding this diversification of species. So in this cauldron, he's got these observations about the different animals, and combining that with Malthus's theories on population, Darwin starts to see something. He starts to see life as a struggle, that because resources are finite in the environment, that there is a pressure exerted by the environment onto individuals of a species to adapt. Basically, species that have something beneficial about them get to harvest said resources and get to propagate their traits, whereas individuals that are less fit for the environment will end up dying and not propagating their traits. So this is really important to get down as something that is true, right? So earlier I alluded that evolution by means of natural selection is a fact, like pretty much a mathematical fact, and this is why I view it that way. One of the assumptions is that there are individual differences amongst individuals in a population of a species, right? And that is true. You take a look at any human, and any single human is quite different than any other human. Any individual cat is different from any other individual cat. And some of those differences will be beneficial. Beneficial meaning allowing for an individual to pass on their heritable characteristics on to the next generation. So, the first assumption, species have variations. Second assumption, some of those variations are ultimately beneficial for that individual. These two are both observable facts. The third assumption is that these traits that are beneficial are also heritable. So I didn't really talk about this too much, but Darwin existed at a time before genetics. So he came up with this idea of evolution before genetics was really commonly adopted. I believe Mendel was alive at the time, or alive or dead, but Mendel's work came before Darwin's work, but was sadly lost and never really popularized. So in terms of heritable traits, that was something that was still being worked on. But what Darwin did know is that artificial selection was happening throughout history, throughout just the lived history of mankind, right? Farmers would propagate crops with beneficial traits that would pass those traits on to the next crop, thus leading to a healthier harvest. You don't even have to look that far for this kind of information, right? You look vaguely like a combination of your mother and your father. So the inheritance of traits was something that was also viewed as fact. So we got these facts. So if you have species, and if those species have a variation, and if some of those traits are more beneficial or less beneficial, and traits can be inherited, then that means that traits that are beneficial will be inherited, right? And that is a powerful argument, but this is all still cooking in Darwin's 20-year grind. And if it were up to Darwin, he would actually have spent more time before publishing his work, if not for Darwin's real-life anime rival, Alfred Russel Wallace. So I kind of think of Alfred Russel Wallace as like Rock Lee from Naruto. He's like the character that you actually want to root for, whereas Darwin, coming from his very privileged background, is harder to root for, right? So let me tell you a little bit about Alfred over here. So in opposition to Darwin, Alfred grew up very modestly. He had a middle-class mom with a father who studied law but didn't end up practicing, instead wanted to do business, but was unfortunately not very good at it. So Alfred Wallace grew up very in financial straits, we'll say. And unlike Darwin, who had this very rich lifestyle, who had his father pay for a trip around the world, Wallace had it really tough. Wallace had to work a lot of different odd jobs, like teaching. He did a bunch of surveying and so taught based on that. And he tried even at one point to manage a failing business. He was just like a dude who was trying to get by. But while he was working these jobs, he was really investing in his exploration of the natural world. So even though he showed up to work, his side gig, his side hobby, was really trying to understand life around him. And that's very admirable, right? You want to cheer for that kind of guy who is trying to follow his heart, but because of capitalism, has to spend a lot of that time committed in a different area. But in spite of those pressures, he continued to follow his passions. And so while Darwin was pretty much dilly-dallying for 20 years, Wallace sends Darwin a draft of his own essay, which was basically Darwin's theory. He gets a lot of Darwin's ideas almost exactly right, even without extensive conversations with Darwin. And he sends this essay to him, and Darwin realizes that he is about to get scooped. Right? So he starts sweating. And in a letter to his mentor, Darwin writes, "Your words have come true with a vengeance, forestalled." And he would, of course, at once write an offer to send Alfred's essay to any journal that Wallace chose, adding that all of my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed. So here is an interesting test of character for Darwin. Right here, he has a copy of this relatively unknown scientist's work, and it is basically a mirror of his own stuff, to the point where he is just in shambles, right? He can't believe that he's about to get scooped this freaking hard. And he could, with his massive amount of influence at the time, bury this essay or rally against it. But he realizes that this is his own work, right? He believes it's his own work, almost word for word. And so instead of burying this, he attempts to publish this immediately, but also adds a little bit of his own work attached to it. So he publishes Wallace's paper alongside with some of his own unfinished work side by side. And Wallace's paper was called On the Tendency of Species to Form Varieties. So, not quite as catchy as On the Origin of Species, but you can kind of see that it has a lot of the same elements, right? So, this was you could call it a mix between good intentioned and cynical. So it's good intentioned in the sense that Darwin didn't try to bury this, right? But it's also a little cynical because he realizes he's about to get scooped. And instead of having Wallace have the limelight, he kind of has to add his own thing just to remind people that he's also thinking about this stuff too. A professor that I used to have said that there was no second place in science, and this was very much a case of Darwin fearing that he will be left in the dust by this relative unknown. But it actually turns out that Darwin didn't really have all that much to fear. And so why might that be? When this was published, it turns out that the people who were on the receiving end of this essay didn't really care for some reason. They thought that the new stuff that Wallace was introducing didn't really have all that much significance. And the stuff that Wallace said that was true, they argued was old stuff. So this was kind of an insignificant footnote in the history of evolution. But Wallace's ideas were similar enough to Darwin that Darwin really thought he was going to get scooped. So what gives? What's the difference? Darwin was a great writer. He had such a way with words, and I think he picked a better, more convincing argument. Even though Darwin viewed their ideas to be identical, apparently Wallace's work focused more on inheritance of groups or the evolution of groups, whereas Darwin had a theory about inheritance and evolution of the individual. So we'll get into talking about natural selection in a little bit. But this was a little bit of like an alternate universe fork, where there's a universe out there where Wallace is credited with being the father of evolution instead of Darwin. It's just kind of an interesting bit of history. The reason why Wallace is most known for today is the fact that this lights a fire under Darwin's ass, right? Darwin was grinding 20 years to publish this huge book on natural selection, his theory as to how evolution happens. And now, because of Wallace slowly getting towards his precious idea, he has to just publish. And so instead of his drawn out magnus opus, he has to publish an abstract, which is still a pretty good length, I would say. It's still going to take you a bit to read through. But he does so, and he calls it On the Origin of Species. And it's a straight up banger. It was released, and the reception could not have been more engaging, I would say. On the left here, we have a sketch that Darwin made in his books about theorizing the structure of the evolution of species. So earlier we saw Lamarck had this two-factor model where you had these two axes of complexifying forces. In Darwin's conception of evolution, it looks more like branches on a tree. And he uses a lot of great analogy and metaphor and narrative to communicate his ideas. So you might be surprised to learn that On the Origin of Species was actually written for the common man. If you pick up this book, if you are practiced and are an avid reader, even if you don't have a background in biology, you should find it to be quite digestible. It's part of the reason why the book was so popular and how Darwin himself got so popular. So, in this book, he details his theory, which is that there are selective forces in nature that put pressure on individuals, and the traits that are able to be passed along to the next generation are the force that elicit the change required for a species to evolve. So, with enough time, with enough generations, with enough successive passages of these traits, you will eventually end up with new species. So, how did people react to this? Before I get into the reaction, I need to point out again, once more, that Darwin was so freaking good at writing. He really knew how to craft an argument, and he had 20 years to do so. And so, this theory of natural selection and, in fact, evolution as a whole, at the time, could not have, well, that's an exaggeration. There were significant portions of the population that would have viewed this idea negatively. And why is that? Because if you take this to its natural conclusion, it kind of points to a shared common ancestor for all life on planet Earth, right? If you take this to its natural conclusion. And people didn't really like that idea because that means that there's not really an inherent difference between people and any other animal, which kind of goes against the whole God created man in his own image, right? We're not special. We're just apes that got a little smarter and stand up a little straighter, right? This would also mean that you don't need the presence of a supernatural power all the way up to the first living organism. And Darwin was keenly aware of that. And so in his writing, he makes sure to kind of avoid that question or sidestep that question, but he doesn't totally ignore it. So I want to share some quotes from The Origin of Species just to see what that was like. So, at the very end of the book, so he goes through all of these chapters, he outlines them in very understandable bits, and all of his arguments build on this theory of natural selection. And he has an entire section where he is able to counter arguments that he estimates he will get. So he's such a masterful rhetorician that he can kind of address problems as they come up, right? And he's so keenly aware of that audience that he's presenting this to that at the very end of the book, after he's made his case, that's actually the time where he throws in a little bit about the origin of man and perhaps a teaser for The Descent of Man, which is a book that he will be publishing much later on in his life. At the very end of the book, he writes, "In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researchers. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." And I just think that it just hits the ear so good. He has such a way of writing in a pleasing sounding way. I really wish I could write with that much poetry. Another quote that I want to share is how he describes selection pressure. And he writes, "A grain in the balance will determine which individual shall live and which shall die, which variety or species shall increase in number and which shall decrease or finally become extinct." So a grain in the balance, I think, is also such a nice way to put things. And towards the end of his book, he leaves off with a quote that I read during my debut stream, and it's another perfect example of why I find Darwin's writing to be so compelling, is his artfulness with language. You know, at the end, after he's made his case, he's aware that there are people that might reject how unsightly this theory of the origin of species might be. You know, the idea that we and apes are not that far apart is saddening, I guess you could say. Like it makes us as humans feel a little less special. But Darwin frames it, I think, in a very positive light, right? He writes, there is, I'm actually going to read the whole quote. So this is an excerpt of the quote, but I think I should probably read the whole quote, which was too large to put in the slide. He writes, it is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from one another and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers having been originally breathed into few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I just think to myself, wow, that's awesome. Because this narrative, I think, is a lot more compelling, personally, than the idea that we were zapped into existence, right? That when you look at any living creature, you are seeing a history of trauma and triumph, right? Our ancestors and our ancestors' ancestors were acted upon by hostile environments in competition with one another, in competition with other species, all crafting the blueprint of our biology that extends to our life to this day. And I think that is such a wonderful and deeply exciting way to view biology. I want to muse a little bit about what this means for me as someone who is more interested in cell and molecular biology, right? You can certainly look at a giraffe with its long neck and muse as to how the giraffe and tall plants in Africa maybe co-evolved. And I think that is a very clean way to view the story of biology, right? These intertwined narratives where characters are playing major roles in each other's character development. If we abstractize, abstractify character as being species. When you look at how clever cells can be, and by clever, I'm assigning them a narrative and purpose, which I have to say is not really kosher when you talk about science, but forgive me. When you look at cells and how clever they can be in their adaptations, I am reminded of this quote. Because the forces that act upon individual cells, which have lifespans far shorter than the species that they inhabit, you end up seeing an evolution of mechanisms that are so efficient you could have mistaken them for a planned design. And to know that these cells, these minute, minimal units of life, have adapted abilities so specialized and so incredible, I just think that that is quite a wonderful thing to be reminded of, right? I did a stream where I ranked organelles on a tier list. You can find that, of course, on my channel. And with the context of evolution, thinking about what history had to have happened to lead to such a complex package of organelles and interconnected processes, I think is pretty amazing. And I think that if you keep in mind while you are learning biology, that biology is basically the story of how everything survived, I think it makes it a lot more fun. So, a common stopping point for people to get into biology, especially if you were taking AP biology, is having to learn something like glycolysis. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar or need a reminder, glycolysis is the process by which cells turn sugar into energy. And for AP biology, at the time that I was familiar with the AP biology curriculum, you basically had to memorize every step. And yes, if you study biology, there will be a lot of memorization, and that turns a lot of people off. I myself have a really bad memory. There are working memory testers online where you can see how many words or how many numbers you can memorize in a short amount of time, and my memory is actually abysmal, right? I can barely remember a phone number no matter how many times it is repeated back to me. And yet I pushed myself forward to specialize in biology for one reason only, and that reason is because I find the narrative of biology to be so compelling. I know it's like not cool to say narrative in a scientific context, but if you view evolution as the narrative, then I think that's probably okay, right? So glycolysis, yes, it's annoying to have to know and memorize all of the steps, but you can think of it this way. Biology is a long, drawn-out story with more characters than maybe all of the characters invented in fiction ever. And in order to really get an appreciation for the story of biology, you have to know the characters. So the characters include cells, includes animals, it includes viruses and bacteria. It includes the environments that they all live in, the biomes. It includes evolution and genetics and morphology studies, anatomy, etc., etc. The more you learn about biology, the more of the story you can actually appreciate. So I hope that whoever may be watching, if you are thinking about studying biology, or even if you're not thinking about studying biology, I hope that hearing me gush about a concept so crucial to modern biology has either inspired you in some way or has let you know that maybe this isn't the thing for you. But at the very least, I hope you found the musing about Darwin to be entertaining. And with that, I will see you next time. Goodbye.